Thanks for listening to this archive of Teaching American History's Documents in Detail webinar for 16 February 2022. The focus of tonight's program was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech, which was drawn from our World War II core documents collection. As always, we were joined by Dr. John Moser of Ashland University and Dr. Jennifer Keene of Chapman University, also the editor of our World War II core documents collection, and Dr. David Krugler of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. Thanks as always for listening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I'm professor of history and chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series, in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically significant documents. We encourage all of you joining us today to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box and not the chat box. That way we don't have to monitor more than one thing at a time. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Within the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation if you would like one, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from tonight's program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from the various volumes of our core documents series. These documents are also available at the Ashbrook Center's voluminous document database located at tah.org. The subject of tonight's program comes from the volume on World War II, edited by Jennifer Keene. The document in question is Franklin Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union address, better known as the Four Freedoms speech. To help discuss it tonight are Dr. Keene herself. She is professor of history and dean of Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at Chapman University, as well as Dr. David Krugler, professor of history at the University of Wisconsin at Platteville. Both of these scholars are faculty members in Ashland University's master's program in American History and Government. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
So I'm really excited about tonight's episode. World War II is probably my favorite topic, and as a matter of fact, I just taught this document in my own World War II class a couple of weeks ago. Why don't we begin by saying a little bit about why this document is so significant?
You want me to start? I'll start.
Why not?
Why not? I think that this document is so significant in part because of its longevity, the ways in which it is a document that is produced during the period of non-belligerence for the United States, and it can be understood in many different contexts as part of the sort of dance that FDR is doing to be able to help Britain, but at the same time respect neutrality laws and the political winds at the moment, which are to not be an active belligerent in the conflict. But it goes on with what it pronounces to really define for Americans what they are fighting for in World War II beyond self-defense or vengeance against Japan. And then obviously, as we move into the post-war period with the United Nations, it sort of gets incorporated into other documents that really lay out the foundations for Cold War foreign policy as well, in terms of why America, as you know, we move from the fight from fascism to communism, what is our ideological stake in these conflicts. So to me, it's a document that both can be contextualized in the moment and the crisis of 1941, but then also kind of builds out from there. And it's one that looks backwards as well, because there's a lot of Wilsonianism in this document. And my favorite war, as anybody who knows me knows, favorite seems weird to say, but the war I spend most of my time talking about is World War I. And it usually takes me, more than 3 minutes to work it into a conversation. But here I went right to it. And so there's a ways in which it's continuing forth and continuing to keep relevant a Wilsonian vision of America's role in the world.
I'll add to what Jennifer just said about this Wilsonian message. I really see this speech as a crystallization of Wilsonianism, and that core message in Wilson's address to Congress requesting war in April of 1917, the world must be made safe for democracy. Here we see FDR putting a finer point on Wilson's core message. What are we talking about specifically? The four freedoms. I also think this address is important because it shows FDR fusing the Great Depression and the New Deal with the menace the United States faces because of Japanese aggression and fascist aggression in Europe. And that comes later in the speech, talks about what is the foundation the healthy life. There's no mystery here. And just because we're focused on these global problems and the threat to our own security, the threat to the Western Hemisphere, we shouldn't give up what we've been fighting for at home about a better standard of living for all. In that sense, he presages the State of the Union address 3 years later when he calls for a second Bill of Rights. And the third reason I think this message is so important is because by calling on Americans to support the four freedoms and to specifically support Great Britain in its fight to save democracy in Europe, Roosevelt unleashes forces that he doesn't expect and cannot control. Just a little later in the year, we have A. Philip Randolph promising to bring tens of thousands of African Americans to Washington to peacefully march for their rights as Americans to participate in the defense industries from which they are being turned away because of racial discrimination. And the March on Washington movement, as it's known, takes this rhetoric of the four freedoms and packages it into civil rights activism. What is freedom from fear, if not freedom from Jim Crow? And that's not what Roosevelt intends here, but that's what he gets.
Yep, that's great.
Yeah, thank you. So let's talk a bit about the context for this speech. What's going on in January 1941? It's only 2 weeks after he gave his Arsenal of Democracy speech. Help us to understand where this fits into what's going on in the world at the moment.
I think I'm sorry, David, I'm going to jump in. Yeah, sorry. I don't have to answer every question first, but I think there's two things that are going on. One is that he's had that press conference where he's kind of let that trial balloon about Lend-Lease go, talking about the idea, that press conference where he has that very famous, we're got to help out a friend. And, what do you do if your friend's house is on fire? You lend them the fire hose. And when the fire is put out, you don't say, pay me $50 for the hose. You just want your fire hose back. And he starts framing this about, again, to sort of maneuver around neutrality legislation that prohibits the selling of arms to nations at war, and obviously the credit crisis that Britain is facing because we're also barred from loans. How do we actually help them at this really critical moment when Britain is the sole nation fighting against Hitler? France has fallen. Hitler has not yet attacked the Soviet Union, and so you're at this crisis moment, and FDR feels it and feels that he has to move public opinion to provide aid to Britain. But at the same time, the memory of World War I and the notion that this was a mistake for the US to enter, that we loaned a lot of money and were left with nations not paying us back, and all the factors that had drawn America into the First World War, the arms trade, this is the notion in the 1930s, seem to be repeating themselves. So it's a political minefield for him, and he comes up with Lend-Lease as sort of this convenient fiction that everybody is interested in embracing because it allows you to hold on to these these strongly held beliefs and don't feel like you're walking those back, but at the same time help Britain, which is what people want to do. So people don't want to get involved, but they want Britain to win the war. And so how do you, and FDR is kind of managing that. So the Lend-Lease and then the Arsenal of Democracy speech, as you mentioned, these are things that are occurring in December, right before the new year. And then the new year happens and he comes to Congress and delivers the State of the Union address. And so part of the political landscape is to build public support for Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease will be passed. It can't be an executive action like some of Roosevelt's earlier things like the Destroyers for Base deal. He has to have, this is going to cost money. So Congress has to appropriate money for Lend-Lease. It has to go to a vote. And he wants to build public support and pressure so that Congress actually goes ahead and passes legislation. So part of that is the here and now, like what is the political agenda that he's actually trying to address. And then I think he is, and we see this in all these speeches, he's building an incremental case for American entry into the war. I mean, he's not ready to say that yet, but and this is where, David, it's interesting what you were saying about how this seems to encapsulate Wilson's Make the World Safe for Democracy. But remember, Wilson, that is the war address. I mean, that's when he goes and says to Congress, I want a declaration of war, and here's why we're going to fight. And this is, Roosevelt's doing this speech in January. I mean, Japan's not going to attack Pearl Harbor until December. So we're like 11 months from America actually entering the war. And FDR is already giving Americans something to fight for. And the way that I'm going to stop in a second, but the way that he phrases it is super cool, I think, because he writes, and I was looking at this yesterday, why are you giving us these ideological things to strive for? And he basically says, well, the workers in the factory and the people on the docks and the people who are creating this arsenal of democracy need to be inspired. Like they have to go that extra mile and do the work that needs to be done. He says the mighty action that we are calling for cannot be based on a disregard for all things worth fighting for. So even the worker has to be inspired to be this arsenal for democracy. So he's militarizing, economic activity and kind of so this is a call for economic mobilization ahead of military mobilization. Although there is also the renewal of compulsory service at the same time.
Right. Yeah, and to add to the political context here, it's important for us to know that Roosevelt has done something no other president in U.S. history has ever done. He's just won a third term, and he's about to be inaugurated for it. And this address, in it, Roosevelt doesn't, throw that down and say, I'm unstoppable or I have a mandate. He works it in some interesting ways. For example, midway through the edited version of the speech we have, so this would be page 3 on a printout, in 3 successive paragraphs, he uses the phrase without regard to partisanship. And it's often preceded by the phrase an impressive expression of the public will. First, second, third, by an impressive expression of the public will and without regard to partisanship, we are committed to all-inclusive national defense. In the second instance, he says, quote, we are committed to full support of all those resolute peoples everywhere who are resisting aggression and are thereby keeping war away from our hemisphere, end quote. And that, when Jennifer, you mentioned that he's got this balancing act and he's preparing the country to go to a war, and he's also managing the fact or responding to the wish of so many Americans that Great Britain win, but they don't want to be in the war directly. That's where he's trying to say this is the pathway for us, that we help those who will keep us out of the war, even though he's recognizing that chances are strong the U.S. will eventually be directly in this war.
And I would just build on that to add, he's dealing with the critics, right? He's got the anti-interventionists in the American First movement who are calling him out, right? Everything you're trying to do, Arsenal for Democracy, all this stuff is going to lead us into the war, that we're not fooled by what your homey analogies. And he has a lot of phrases in here about the realist, right? every realist knows, right? No realistic American. Like he's really, I mean, it's not widely distributed at the time. So sometimes we see that Dr. Seuss cartoon, you know, where he draws the ostrich with the head in the sand, like, and then labels it America First. We know that at the time, this is not a widely distributed graphic, but it actually encapsulates sort of what he's saying. Like, these people are head in the sand, they're not facing the facts on the ground, and I'm going to talk straight to you, and this is about, you know, the real, you are a realist, you see it. And that's interesting. He's not calling them out directly, but I think that's another political challenge that he has.
It puts me in mind of his press conference in December, the one you mentioned earlier, Jennifer, and how he uses multiple times the term selfish. It's in our selfish interest. So yeah. It's almost as though he really wants to avoid being cast as a dreamy, idealistic Anglophile, or even a Wilsonian.
Yes, yeah.
So there are a few things I wanted to mention. Dave, thanks for bringing up the fact that Roosevelt had just been elected to a third term. It's interesting. He doesn't say much about foreign policy during the campaign. Certainly, he doesn't come up with a lot of big initiatives for helping the British. I mean, the Destroyers for Bases deal was actually a really good deal for the United States, right. Arguably better for the United States than it was for Britain. Mm-hmm. But then the election comes almost immediately after, only about a month afterward, there's the proposal for Lend-Lease comes up. So he's obviously feeling liberated to make stronger initiatives in this direction. And that leads me to my question. We've got a few questions from audience members that I want to get to soon, but I want to hear what you think about this. Do you think FDR wants to go to war? Or is he, like many Americans, in the situation of thinking, I really don't want to do this, but we want to give the British and other allies all the assistance we can? Perhaps so it's a way of keeping out of war. He, of course, says in his Arsenal of Democracy speech, he makes very clear, this is how we're going to stay out. What do you think about that? Does FDR want to enter the war?
So I'll answer that by saying, I think Roosevelt believes the U.S. entry, direct and full entry into the war, is inevitable well before Pearl Harbor. I don't think it's in January of 1941. As Jennifer mentioned, we don't have the invasion of the Soviet Union yet, and we don't have German U-boats menacing the Lend-Lease shipments. I would date the inevitability or the point of no return for Roosevelt as the Greer incident in September of 1941, when he really misrepresents an altercation between an old U.S. destroyer and a German U-boat and a British plane. I think you could make the case at that point, Roosevelt has accepted the inevitability of U.S. entry into the war, and now it's a matter of maneuvering the U.S. into the best position. I don't know that he wanted that to happen, but when he issues a shoot-on-sight order for U.S. naval vessels on German U-boats, and Hitler's telling the Kriegsmarine, the U-boats, don't fire unless you have to. I mean, think about that. Hitler's saying hold your fire, and Roosevelt saying shoot them on sight, even though the U.S. is a neutral nation. I think at that point he knows war is inevitable.
I also think that it's just so interesting how he's laying the groundwork for, if I end up having to lead this nation into war, I will be in a better position to attain my, not just victory over my enemy, but the larger goals that America has whenever it goes to fight than Woodrow Wilson was. So, going back to what we were talking about before, I'm not waiting for my war address to lay out what the ideological vision is of what our stake is in this war. I'm laying it out in our Arsenal of Democracy speech. I'm laying it out in the Four Freedoms. And I'm not waiting until almost a year of being in this conflict to get to the nitty-gritty. And I'm thinking here of Wilson's 14 points, which doesn't come out until January 1918. We've already been in the war for almost 9 to 10 months. with the Atlantic Charter, which follows on the 14 points. Again, this is in August of 1941. Roosevelt is meeting with Churchill and laying out I don't know how many points, I have to look at it, but like how many points there are, but the points with, okay, now the Soviet Union's in this conflict, the peace is going to look like this. And the peace is going to look like free trade, capitalism, self-determination. It's not going to look like communism. And I mean, that's exactly the situation Wilson was in with the 14 points with the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay, now peace might go in a completely different direction. It could be authoritarian or anti-fascist, but does that necessarily translate into democratic and capitalist? And I think that all of this is happening ideologically for FDR this is all before the Greer incident. It's before Pearl Harbor. So then when we get to Pearl Harbor and the day that will live in infamy, he doesn't say any of this. I mean, this is just like we're gonna get vengeance, right? He doesn't need to give the 16-page war address that Wilson had to give to say, oh, by the way, this is why we need to enter in this war. He's already laid it all out. So I agree with you, David, that this is not saying, oh, I know we're going to fight, but he's really got his ducks in a row in a very interesting way. So at the time, people are ready to go, and it's beyond of course, we need to avenge this attack against us. There's that ideological, and it's connected clearly to economic security as well. The New Deal, this becomes another part of it, an integral vision of what democracy looks like.
Okay, we've got a bunch of questions. A couple of viewers have seized on the FDR's mention of the concentration camp. And they're both asking some variant of the question, how much did FDR know at the time about what was going on in the camps? Obviously, we're not really talking about the Holocaust yet, or the final solution, but yeah, what sense did he have about what was going on in Nazi-occupied Europe?
He should have had a pretty good sense because his ambassador, William Dodd, came back and was trying to tell him. And a lot of that was being funneled through parties in the State Department who didn't want the president to hear that. And Roosevelt had never been big on Dodd to begin with, so he was removed. But Dodd was saying, look, this is what the Nazis are about is murder. They are working their way methodically toward mass murder of Jews. And after he's fired as ambassador, he comes back to the United States and does a speaking tour where he's saying that. I don't know that in Roosevelt's mind, he's thinking this is where the Germans are going. And I think that reference to quicklime in the ditch, and John, you may be able to better answer that than I can. I think that's a reference to Japanese atrocities in China, because we don't have the mass murder on the Eastern Front yet. I mean, there are atrocities in Poland, but the Soviet Union has not yet been invaded. And so the mass murder by the Einsatzgruppen that then leads to the final solution of the death camps, that hasn't occurred yet. So I think that might be a reference to what's happening in Asia.
Well, I mean, the Einsatzgruppen were active in the Polish campaign. And so he might be referring to that. He might be referring to Japan. But why you bring up Japan, I want to ask, why does FDR say so little about? I mean, this could go for really any of his speeches. He almost never mentions Japan.
Well, I think for him, there's a sense of trying to keep the Japanese situation manageable while the real threat, there had been obviously moments with the invasion of China, Manchuria, that, and then, pushing down into Southeast Asia, that there's trouble spots, but those seemed containable. And I think in Europe, just the lightning speed in which Europe falls, and the psychological shock of France falling, which I think was significant, and really you have Britain alone, for a full year, basically standing between a completely, German-controlled Europe and the United States, and given the historic ties to Europe, the importance of them as a trading partner, the ways in which, I mean, he talks about this maybe more in the Arsenal of Democracy than the Four Freedoms speech, but the ways in which the ocean is a highway, not a barrier. And if Britain falls, that last, and I think there is still with Japan, yes, a concern about our Pacific possessions, but there's not a sense that Japan is knocking on the coast, on the door of California, and this is an imminent threat to our territorial sovereignty. And I think that the cultural proclivity to look to Europe, the historic ties to Europe, the trading ties to Europe, the ways in which this crisis seems to be replicating what had happened 20 years earlier. I mean, all of it sort of creates this European focus in which I think to him, this is the most critical crisis. And that, and I'm not sure that we would disagree with him about that. I mean, that this really does seem like to be the most critical crisis, and in the time that, he's writing these speeches. That would be my take on it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, no, just very quickly. I mean, I agree completely with Jennifer, because what we see once the U.S. is in the war is this Europe first strategy, and the commanders in the Pacific are beside themselves. I mean, Douglas MacArthur creates a lot of his own trouble, but he has a point that so much is going toward Europe that Japan is going to be able to strengthen itself to a point where it's going to be a very hard war to win. But Roosevelt and George C. Marshall's attitude seems to be, we've really got to focus on Europe first. The Japanese have their sphere that they want to control, and we're going to have to end that. But as Jennifer said, they're not on the way to California, and the Germans are on their, or even world conquest. But the Germans are about that.
Yeah, I always get the feeling like the Japanese, it's kind of like a slow burn. Like, yes, we need to take care of that, but we can take our time. It's not the sense of urgency.
Jennifer, I sort of blundered forward with my Japan question without getting your thoughts on the reference to concentration camp.
No, I didn't. I thought we answered that really well. I didn't. Oh. I wasn't. Don't worry. I'm not shy. I jump in if I have something to say. You can't stop me from sharing my opinion. That's all right.
One of the things I've always liked about you, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Joe Rooney asks, what does FDR mean when he says that we should shame people reluctant to get with his program, that shame them by example, and if that fails, quote, to use the sovereignty of government to save government? He also says the Four Freedoms seems kind of ill-defined. Mm-hmm. Is that a reflection of some vague policy goal, or does he feel a need to kind of obfuscate his goals?
Well, I can maybe answer the second part of that question. I mean, to me, again, I read the Four Freedoms through the prism of Wilsonianism, and I feel that this is, Wilson is a great intellectual, but his rhetoric does not always resonate with the common man because of the way that he frames things in very legalistic language, in very sort of precise constructions in which, and this is a big argument people have about Wilsonian scholars have about him, which is that he says the world must be made safe for democracy. And there are scholars that say that passive voice he made is very intentional on Wilson's part. And so therefore he is not saying America must make the world safe for democracy, but this is the task of, democratic nations overall. And yet it gets interpreted as meaning him saying America alone must go out and have this missionary crusade. So this is the kind of discussion you have with Wilsonian scholars about his rhetoric. And I think that here, to me, I mean, FDR rhetorically is a different animal, and he has that common touch. And so I think that a lot of the construction of this is his ability to be opaque and all things to all people. And so in the 14 points, in the Four Freedoms, he's really picking up on things that are going to resonate with lots of audiences in America for different reasons. So freedom of speech and expression and freedom of every person to worship God. Well, these are embedded in the Constitution. So he knows that people have expectations of these as rights, but at the same time, they can be seen as real concerns about self-determination or about anti-religious ideologies like fascism or communism that you could take to another level. And then the freedom from want and freedom from fear. I mean, he's been talking about this for 7-8 years. I mean, this is the New Deal rhetoric. I mean, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Freedom from want. I mean, this idea of economic security being the backbone of any democratic society, and the people have been accustomed to that language. So to me, there's a vagueness to it, but there's, I feel on his part, an expectation that people will understand what he means because they're not reading it, they're not hearing it for the first time, and they're not hearing it in a vacuum. This is the way I keep saying Wilson. This is the way FDR, you can see how stuck in World War I am. This is how FDR has been talking to the American people for pretty much his entire presidency.
Yeah, just to add to that and then circle back to the first part of the question about how to shame the malcontents into cooperation. I mean, it's really brilliant how he scaffolds these freedoms to talk about what's essential to the United States, and freedom of speech and freedom of worship. I mean, that's where most Americans encounter the Constitution, right? I mean, that's like a daily activity. He's not going to bring up the Third Amendment or the 10th Amendment, because those are either obsolete or abstract protection. So speech and worship, freedom from want, that allows him to bring in the domestic side, and he develops that very specifically elsewhere in the speech, when he says, for example, on page 4, there's nothing mysterious about the foundations of a healthy and strong democracy. The basic things expected by our people of their political and economic systems are simple. They are equality of opportunity, jobs for those who can work, security for those who need it. This is freedom from want. I mean, this is where he can bring the New Deal in. So I think there's some specificity about that third freedom earlier in the address. And in disarmament, I mean, again, this brings us back to Wilson, because this is one of the goals of the League of Nations, is to bring disarmament. Now, that statement about shaming people, and if that fails, using the sovereignty of the government to save government, I mean, I think that's a really sticky phrase. I mean, and one that stands out too. Like, what is Roosevelt saying? That, the president can suspend habeas corpus, as Lincoln did, to save the government? Is he intimating that as chief executive, he will amass great war powers? Or is it less intimidating? Is it a statement that he will not stand, and the nation, the majority of the nation will not stand for people to use their freedom of speech to, try and sow opposition to all of this?
I think it depends.
Go ahead.
It depends what people are opposed. What are they opposing? So are you opposing peacetime conscription? Are you opposing the ways in which more productivity is asked of you as a worker? Are you opposing any idea of aiding Britain at all? So you're an American first, adherent. I think that there's kind of he's really vague on that, and there seems to be a sense from being a slacker, like just not picking up your responsibility as a citizen, to outright treasonous behavior because you're supporting Hitler, or you're seeing positive thing, you're kind of a fifth columnist. So there's a kind of spectrum here, and the ways in which peer pressure and the kind of public shaming worked really well in World War I when it came to getting people to get on board and do things that maybe they didn't initially feel like they wanted to do, all the way to the Espionage and Sedition Acts, where we're going to throw you in jail if you continue your activity. And of course, the Espionage Act, we really focus on now the aspect of limiting free speech, but a lot of the Espionage Act is about being a spy. It is about espionage. And those are the parts that we still have with us. So big sections of it are a recognition of the fact that there are spies in the nation. That this is, and I'm sure this is another recognition here, that there are people who are conducting espionage. So to me, there's the vagueness in kind of how we're going to approach it also suggests that there's different levels of potential non-compliance versus outright treasonous behavior that he's kind of subtly giving a nod to.
You know, to me, it put me in mind, maybe I'm off base on this, but it put me in mind of his first inaugural, where he kind of put Congress on notice. If you don't give me the kind of, if you don't give me the power that I want, I will ask for emergency powers to handle the depression as if it were a war.
Yeah.
So it's just a reminder. I've got power here, and I will not hesitate to use it if I feel like I have to.
Well, and the people have power too, right? So if you're calling for public shaming of people, you're also talking about self-policing and the self-policing of communities. So if you believe me when I tell you this is an existential crisis for the survival of this country, and you see your neighbors refusing to get on board, then you as a loyal American will step up and make sure you do your best to get them to cooperate or do their part. And I think that that's always something we forget in both the world wars, that we see it as a moment in which power is increasingly centralized in the federal government. And we forget the ways in which we still remain a very federalized system and decentralized society. And a lot of the compliance comes through local enforcement and people and local committees. And, it's not just enough to have an edict on top and use federal agencies. And he doesn't even have the kind of power he's going to have in 2 years in terms of federal reach. But if you make a speech like this and you get everybody else all riled up, you can actually get a lot done through friends and neighbors. I mean, look at how conscription works in the US, right? It's local boards that get the quotas they have to fill, but it's the local white male elite that basically ends up deciding who goes and who stays. And so it's communities that are picking the men who go forth. So it's that part of it. He's that public shaming to me is such a hark back to what happened in the First World War in terms of this how we actually mobilized. And he's kind of making the same suggestion. That's how I interpret it. But I look at everything through the prism of World War I. So that's my special skill.
I think we touched upon Jennifer, you mentioned the anti-interventionists, and I think this speech is very mindful of what's going to be said in opposition to him. We also have at the teachingamericanhistory.org site, Charles Lindbergh's speech 1 month later, February 6th, "We are not ready for war," in which Lindbergh, lets loose on Roosevelt. If you look at the end of the speech, Lindbergh says the greatest threat we have to liberty is right here at home. And it's a thinly veiled reference to Roosevelt. So Roosevelt is anticipating that spokespeople like Lindbergh can really have considerable sway on public opinion and might block this bill. I mean, Lindbergh is speaking out against Lend-Lease. And we also got someone asked in the Q&A if, Roosevelt is putting the German-American Bund on notice, and perhaps he is issuing a warning. I mean, he asks, indeed directs the FBI to go after the Bund with every resource they have. I mean, one of the consequences of that is that communists are not seen as a threat, and they're not going after the communists who are in the government too. All the resources go toward the Bund. So, domestic critics, supporters of fascism at home, I think they are being put on alert.
I mean, I think he calls them out more in the Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat. I mean, I feel like there he really goes after them like directly, and here it's a little more. And again, I think that's where it's important to consider how people are listening to these addresses kind of one after the other, and they're building on each other. It's not just this. Again, it's the first time I've ever heard you say this, so he just feels to be echoing those themes a little bit. From it as he sort of progresses through his own thinking of action, not just thought.
Yeah, I mean, he really goes after them in the Arsenal of Democracy.
He really does.
And is that he talks about some in Congress. I won't say that they're foreign agents, but they're saying the same thing that foreign agents would
exactly right.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question. I'd like to see what you make of this. Kimberly Kowalski asks, can you please touch on the one point from the beginning? When I read the first is freedom of speech and expression, it calls to mind Martin Luther King's mountaintop speech. He says, "Be true to what you said on paper," referencing the Constitution. Is there some, might there be some connection between the two, at least on King's end?
I don't know if King had in mind this specific speech, but certainly, as I mentioned earlier, Roosevelt is unleashing forces. I mean, he is inspiring a movement that he has no intention to inspire. I mean, he doesn't want civil rights to be an issue. He doesn't want a march in Washington. He doesn't want to deal with racial segregation. When Walter White meets with him, he says, "I can't support this legislation because the anti-lynching legislation, because then I will get no cooperation in Congress." He's saying that during the New Deal, but that carries over into the war. And so it's not just King, it's A. Philip Randolph, it's others who are molding this rhetoric to their purposes. And one area in which we do see strong influence on King through Roosevelt is the March on Washington, which the full name of was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And that was really A. Philip Randolph's show. That was the March on Washington that was supposed to take place in 1941. And again in 1943, when Randolph again called it off. It's Randolph who fuses political and economic rights, building off Roosevelt. And that's what King is then doing late in his life with the Poor People's Campaign. So I think there is a lot of congruence, if not necessarily a consciousness on the part of King. But I think certainly there's a consciousness, a choice on the part of Randolph to use this rhetoric.
And I think just building on that, David, that it shows Randolph is savvy because, well, in so many ways, but also in our earlier discussion about, public shaming or the powers of the government to protect the government, like these are the only options. And Randolph, is basically threatening to withhold this cooperation. We're going to withhold our participation in building this arsenal of democracy and even serving in the military until we get some concessions. And so it's also this sense of, this need of compliance on the part of the American public also opens up some spaces for negotiation and to exercise power from certain groups to say, okay, yes, but these are our demands for actually agreeing to jump on board. And that, that's not something that Roosevelt is anticipating in this speech. It's not just the rhetorical part of it. I think he would anticipate, because again, this is not new. I mean, in the First World War, the same thing had happened in the Civil Rights Movement with the democratic rhetoric gets, picked up by the Civil Rights Movement to say, look at how we're a bunch of hypocrites in terms of this isn't even happening in our own country. But I don't think what he could anticipate is that Randolph would find a way to engage in peaceful, collective, nonviolent action to really put some muscle behind the rhetorical demand for full equality and full participation and full economic opportunity for everybody. And that's a kind of new strategy, and it's a surprise for him, but it shows that you're opening up this space where now you've acknowledged that you need us to participate, and here's the price of our participation. And to me, that's really interesting, because we want to think about how wars are transforming society, and here Randolph is paving a way for the next phase of the Civil Rights Movement to really think about not just engaging in, let's have a closed door meeting with the president and kind of very politely, or maybe not so politely, give him a list of our dreams and hopes and demands, but we have economic clout too, and we can wield that to actually gain concessions. And that, when we start fast forwarding to the Civil Rights Movement and we see bus boycotts and things like that, that is the Civil Rights Movement in the Black community wielding its economic clout to bring people to the negotiating table and to gain concessions. And Randolph is a labor organizer. He's using the tactics of the trade union movement to deal with Roosevelt at this critical moment. And that's a blind spot for Roosevelt in the speech, right? It's like, you're gonna shame people into doing it, or the FBI is gonna come knock on your door. Not you're gonna come back to me and say, guess what? We've got some power too here. And that's what's really interesting about, I love that you brought up the March on Washington movement, because I think it really gets us to the domestic aspect of the impact of this speech in a way that we don't often pay attention to.
Tara Abramson asks, if FDR alludes to the U.S. entering the war in his speeches, what's he saying to Churchill during this time?
Nothing of strong commitment one way or the other, right? I mean, this is FDR's way of doing diplomacy. I think too much is made of their relationship because Churchill is really anxious for Roosevelt to commit more, and Roosevelt wants to maintain maximum flexibility. So he's saying, yes, you can count on us, we're going to help, but my hands are tied, or I have to move slowly, or let's see what we can do. I mean, I think that's more the messaging to Churchill. I don't think there's this, don't worry, this is going to happen, just let me do my thing. I think he's being a little circumspect with Churchill, even when they draft the Atlantic Charter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that he's keeping options open, and I think he what he doesn't want is for Britain to capitulate and to sign a separate peace. And so I think he has to be encouraging enough to keep Britain in the fight, but not so encouraging that Britain assumes that America is going to come and save Britain anytime soon. And the fact is, we're unprepared for this war, just like we're unprepared for World War I. And it's going to take a long time before we make any real military difference in Europe. And so even declaring war in and of itself is not, that means within days, American troops are in Britain and making a real difference. So there's also a kind of caution there as well. But I think that's always the problem, and that's the issue when the Soviet Union enters the war and we immediately extend Lend-Lease, is that, one of the nightmare scenarios is separate pieces. And that's happened before, could have happened again. And then what?
So I don't know if either of you have seen Churchill's December 7th, 1940 letter to Roosevelt. So a year to a day before Pearl Harbor, but he's congratulating him for winning re-election. It says, here's our situation right now. The good news is Hitler's not going to be able to invade us. He's not going to be able to break the will of the British people from the air. The only thing that's really terrifying is there's German submarines are sinking more ships faster than we can replace them. And he asks for a series of things from Roosevelt. And what's interesting is in the coming months, FDR delivers on practically all of them. And it really, he all but asks for Lend-Lease, or just try to come up with some way of taking care of our financial difficulties. So a couple of people have asked about reaction to this speech. For instance, how did the Republican opposition respond? What response, if any, was there from abroad, from other sectors of the American people? What do you know about how this speech was received?
Well, one famous response about Lend-Lease comes from Robert Taft, and I don't know if it was, I don't know exactly about the timing, if it was in response to this speech or when the bill itself emerged, but Taft, Republican senator from Ohio, called out and this might have actually been to the Arsenal Democracy speech that you don't loan weapons of war and war essential materials because you don't get them back. It's like chewing gum. You're actually giving it away. And this is part of a pattern for Taft to go after the president for his rhetorical subterfuge, as Taft sees it. And that's what the general Republican response is, at least part of the Republican response, because you've got a lot of liberal Republicans in the Northeast who are more interventionist. I mean, a lot of the opposition intervention is within Roosevelt's own party. I mean, this crosses party lines.
I'll make a comment. I want to tie it to the question we have about the four freedoms by Norman Rockwell, because I think that becomes this visual representation of the four freedoms that really embeds it in this very nostalgic, romanticized view of, the salt of the earth, American citizen and town, and that these are, sort of values as American as apple pie. And to link that to when we think about the opposition, to think about, letters or speeches that people are given, but also this kind of war of political cartooning that's going on at the period. And it's really interesting. I did a project once where I looked at political cartoons in the Chicago Tribune, which was really anti-Roosevelt, really anti-interventionist. And it was really interesting how even in the political cartoons, they were giving voice to one of the main critics of these speeches and this foreign policy, Herbert Hoover, so his predecessor, obviously Lindbergh, but really the way in which, visually they were poking holes in all these arguments Roosevelt was making. So you say, any day now, German submarines are going to be on our shores, but they can't even cross the English Channel. So this is a fake threat. Oh, we've heard this all before. Here comes the parade again. Here come all the promises of world peace, and war is the way to usher in, this utopia. But what does war really bring us? Debt, death. 20 years and then another dictator comes in. There's a way in which they take all of these arguments in these, the collection of these speeches we're sort of talking about, not just the four freedoms, and really begin to embed it in like people's lived experiences and the ways that you could offer a counter view. And I really do like to include that in the conversation, because I feel sometimes when we talk about these documents, there's a sense of inevitability about this. FDR's right. We knew it was going to end up this way, and this was the only way it could have gone. And I disagree with that. I think that when you listen to the anti-interventionists, they have reasonable points to be making. They have reasonable things to be criticizing about the way Roosevelt is even framing the conversation, and that it teaches us, reminds us not to have this sense of inevitability as we read this, like, oh, of course this is what we were going to fight for, and of course this is what happens next, and of course Roosevelt was right to be misleading people, because in the end we needed to defeat Hitler. And so that to me is the visual conversation that's going on, and that's the way a lot of people are consuming the information, and how these speeches, who sits down and reads presidential speeches? Like hardly anybody. And yes, he's giving it as a speech, but even then, we know that people tune into their radios and things. But to me, the visual element is also a way in which these arguments are both reinforced and challenged.
Jeff Vingo asks, what was FDR's view on Wilson? Is he critical of the failure of World War I? Presumably is the failure of the Versailles Treaty, or is he supportive of the plan in order to get Wilsonian ideals in place?
My take on FDR is that he was a great admirer of Wilson. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I and served Wilson, but he was a much better politician than Wilson, and he understood that to invoke Wilson's name would be problematic, and that's putting it mildly. I mean, it could be disastrous for him in his electoral chances, going for a third term, for example. But you can be Wilsonian without mentioning Woodrow Wilson, and we've talked about that tonight. Just the crystallization of Wilsonianism here. But I want Jennifer. I'm very eager to hear what Jennifer has to say on this, because she knows the relationship between Wilson and Roosevelt much better than I do, or Roosevelt's views on Wilson.
Right. I mean, I agree with everything you've said, and I think it really depends who he's talking to. So when he's talking to the Democratic Party faithful, he mentions Wilson all the time, because Wilson is our great father, the great father of Democratic, that there is no walking away from him. And if you look at his campaign speeches, when he's running for president for the first time, he evokes Wilson constantly. And so I think there's a sense in which Wilson was misunderstood, that he was a prophet. He understood, and not just on his foreign policy, which is obviously what we're talking about today, but the way in which he had embodied key progressive reforms that were important to New Dealers. So you had a lot of people who had were still around in the New Deal, who had been also around in the progressive moment, or had been part of the mobilization during the First World War. And you think about this, the idea of the analog of war, and the ways in which people who had run governmental agencies during the First World War were called in to run New Deal agencies in the 1930s. And so this sense that this shared vision of the government's role in protecting the common good, and arresting this slide into either monopolistic capitalism, or anarchist / Bolshevik chaos, was this progressive ethos that FDR clearly embraced, and brought into his government other people who embraced this. And these people all cut their teeth, on Wilsonian ideals, and as part of that earlier movement. So to me, there's not really any division here. And like you pointed out, he's smart enough, like, especially at this moment, he's not going to be evoking Wilson, because Wilson did go to war, and he's trying to, sort of slip around, saying, we probably, I don't know, our foreign policy is not directed towards war, it's towards staying out of war. So this is the wrong moment to bring Wilson up. But I don't think there's any moment that he rejects Wilson. And we should not also forget that there's a lot of loyalty to Wilson and Wilsonianism within the Democratic Party, and that's not so that sometimes in certain moments it's a political advantage to be explicit about that.
Right. I mean, yet the affinity as progressives perhaps is as strong, if not stronger, than this foreign policy connection.
Yeah.
Wilson famously or infamously, depending on your point of view, says, well, in these modern times, we might need to change the Constitution to fit these times. And in 1944, that's what Roosevelt is saying. He says we need a second Bill of Rights. We need an economic Bill of Rights. I mean, it's very easy to envision Wilson saying that in a slightly different form in 1913.
Well, if you think about it, in Wilson's time, 4 constitutional amendments are added. So there is this sense of it as a very much a living document that has to speak. And I guess Roosevelt's responsible for one. Drink up.
We'll give him credit for 2, because the 22nd Amendment is a direct response to his electoral.
Well, I was about to say,
he's not around to see it. But
in his legacy, yes, in his legacy.
Yeah, 2 terms only.
One last quick question, and it's a variant of what Rhonda Stang asked almost at the very top of the hour. We're talking to a group of over 100 people, most, if not all of whom are teachers. How would you take this document and make it relevant to high school students today?
I would say, take them to the 4 freedoms, and that's an easy answer, but I would say get them to focus on the tagline that ends almost verbatim in every instance, each freedom, everywhere in the world, everywhere in the world, everywhere in the world, and then the 4th, to be free from fear anywhere in the world. And that might be something to catch high school students' interest, to ask, well, is this, proper? Is this fitting? Should this be the case? That this should be everywhere?
Jennifer.
I agree. And I think that in the conclusion of the address, there is this statement: freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. And I think that also builds on that same theme of how universalistic is this vision, and what role does this presume the United States should have in the world? And to me, that's, if you're linking it to the foreign policy aspect of our conversation, that this is a moment where the American century is sort of beginning. And are we at a moment when the American century has come to an end? And is that because we have come to feel that this is overexpansive? But the second part, if you want to go domestic, is I think to look at earlier in the speech, where he really says there's nothing mysterious about the foundations of a healthy and strong democracy. The basic things expected by our people of their political and economic systems are simple. They are. And then he really lists out this sort of progressive / New Deal / great society vision of what constitutes the proper role of the government domestically to ensure economic security. And to me, that's very relevant because there's no consensus on that still today. And so, what role did the government have during the corona pandemic? What do we think about universal health care? I mean, these are all issues that we're debating, and our students are the voters of the future who are going to determine a lot of the answers to the questions for the future. And that to me seems still that relevancy seems very clear to me.
Right. Well, I want to thank both of our panelists, Jen and Dave, as well as our participants for their terrific questions. As a reminder, you'll be receiving an email within the next week. That email will include a link for a certificate of participation. It will also contain a link to the archived webinar. Please, please, please share this with your colleagues. Share it on social media. Help us get the word out. If you've enjoyed tonight's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course or an in-person graduate course in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can find more information about our course offerings, as well as many other resources for teachers at teachingamericanhistory.org. Our next episode of Documents in Detail will take place on the evening of Wednesday, March 16th, when our topic will be Harry Truman's farewell address to the American people from the core document volume on the Cold War. And here to talk about it with us on that occasion will be Dr. David Krugler, again, joining us from the University of Wisconsin at Platteville. Dave is also editor of that volume. And Dr. David Hadley of National Defense University. Thanks for being with us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again on March 16th.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our documents, programs, and resources for teachers and students at teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org.